All right, so uh, hearing reverb. All right, welcome everyone. Okay,
Morning.
Morning.
Morning,
Okay.
Rashada.
Morning.
Okay, I'm going to mute everyone. I have that power. All right. Just to get us started, and then I will allow you guys to unmute yourselves if you have questions. Also, put questions in the chat, and I can tell Dr. Sherwood that there are questions. But this is so we have about 18, so I'll just do the welcome. Welcome, this is our 4th summer series for STORK, our last minute kind of pivot to get something online. I think it's been successful between the journal clubs and the talks. And so this talk is about pre-registration 101. I think it's super exciting, very relevant right now, because this is something we all can be doing in our research programs and with students to kind of get over the COVID hump, plateau, wherever it will take us. So without further ado, Jennifer Sherwood is our speaker. She's from Cal State East Bay, and I'm going to hand it over to her, except she's muted. Are you good? Jennifer, are you unmuted? All right, sorry, we're having. Okay, here she is.
I'm unmuted. So good morning, everyone. So I'm going to talk about pre-registration. So I'm involved with STORK, so I'm obviously very interested in open science practices, of which pre-registration is one. But with the public health response to COVID-19, I became really interested in pre-registration. And so in January, early this year, my research team, composed of several students, were actively collecting data. And then in March, people in the United States started to develop COVID-19. And so the public health response, the necessary public health response, was to shelter in place. And so all research activity was shut down. So this meant that for our research team, we weren't able to collect any more data, and we use human subjects. So I'm not sure when this is going to be reinstated, or when we're going to be able to collect data again. So places are starting to open up, but looking really different than they did pre-COVID. And so this is a picture taken in late June of this year. This is from Johns Hopkins. And what you'll notice is there's one researcher in this lab. And so that's to adhere to the social distancing requirements and the mask requirements. To adhere to the social distancing requirements, people that are allowed in the lab there's only like 1 or 2 people at a time. So people are needing to schedule to go into the lab, and also where they are able to work in the lab is really limited. And so what you'll notice is this blue tape on the floor where this person is working. And that blue tape confines that person to that workspace, because once they are ready to leave, they have to clean up everything. And so to prevent the spread of the virus, work in the lab looks really different. So that means more researchers are at home, more research assistants are at home. And so I started to look at pre-registration as a way to keep my research going, and also to work with my students on my research team, because I really enjoy working with students, and so I wanted to continue that. And so you may not know what pre-registration is, so I will start from the beginning. And so it all began, the majority of it began with Daryl Bem. And so he is a well-respected social psychologist, and he works at he's worked at many very prestigious universities. In 2011, he published a paper reporting the results of 9 experiments that showed that extrasensory perception, the ability to see in the future, was real. And so he published this in a well-respected, high-impact journal. It was the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. And so researchers were reading the results of his experiment in this manuscript, and were thinking this is a hoax. And then they were completely surprised that this paper was able to get through all the rigors of peer review, which you would expect is supposed to make sure that only replicable science is published. And so replication is a integral part of science. And so Dr. Bem welcomed people to replicate his results. And so there were a few researchers that took on that challenge. And so they replicated the experiments of Dr. Bem to the T with the same number of subjects, and their results were, they found no statistical significance, and they found that there was no support for extrasensory perception. And this didn't surprise them. And so they wrote up their results, and they submitted this to the same journal that Dr. Bem's work was submitted, and they were rejected. And they'd sent it to the editor, and the editor had said, they outright rejected it, didn't even send it out for a peer review. And so for people that don't really understand what that, there's some students on the call that don't really understand maybe what that is. It's like if you submitted your assignment to a professor and the professor said, you get an F, I'm not even going to grade it. And so the researchers decided that they still wanted to publish their results in a high impact journal. So they submitted their results to several other high impact journals, and several of the other journals, the editors refused them outright. They didn't even send them out for peer review. And then finally, they found a journal that sent their results out to reviewers. And the first reviewer of this, their results, said, this is a great paper, I recommend it to be published. And then the second reviewer said, this is terrible, it shouldn't be published. And so later on, the researchers found out that this reviewer that rejected their paper was Dr. Bem himself. So this exposed a lot of problems with science. It exposed questionable research practices. It exposed that these papers that don't have statistically significant results are not getting published. And so this really launched what is called the replication crisis. And so it is a crisis. And so open science is a way for us to address this crisis in research. And so the replication, or the ability to address the replication crisis, really started with psychology. And so psychology and sports psychology are more mature in trying to address this replication crisis, although now it's spreading to other disciplines, which is a really great thing. And so, can't advance my slide, there we go. And so pre-registration is one type of open science practice, and there's 2 types of pre-registration. There's the not peer-reviewed pre-registration, and then there's the peer-reviewed pre-registration. And so we're going to start talking about the not peer-reviewed and leave the peer-reviewed for a little bit later in the talk. And so pre-registration is a document, and it's where you outline your hypothesis and your predictions and your study design, including your methods, the types of subjects, the inclusion, exclusion criteria, how you're going to collect your data, your outcome variables, rules for excluding data, and it defines your statistical analysis plan. So what groups you're planning to test, what groups you're planning to use as a control, and pre-registration should be done before you collect any data. So this is before you recruit your subjects, before you collect your data. And so a couple of things with pre-registration. So pre-registration will help to reduce such questionable research practices as p-hacking. And so p-hacking is where you, and this happens very frequently in research, where you have your data and you perform several statistical inferences looking for the statistically significant result. And so if you know about statistics, then you know the more inferences that you run, the less rigorous the statistics is. And and it also helps to prevent something called harking, which is proposing a hypothesis after you've seen the results of your data, which is another questionable research practice. So pre-registration, we're going to talk about the not peer-reviewed pre-registration. It's you're publishing on a website, in a paper, you're going to do your study, your data analysis before data is collected. And it allows you, one of the advantages is it allows you to correct mistakes before investing any time and money. And you create a permanent time-stamped record so that if someone is thinking about doing the same result or the same study as you, they could search the web, find your pre-registration, and so then they could know that that study is being performed. And so maybe they could change their study, or if you're worried about being scooped for a study, which is someone publishes the results before you get the chance to write up your results, your pre-registration is a time-stamped record so that you will get credit for the idea. And the other good thing about pre-registration is that you can keep the pre-registration private, so not make it public. And on some websites, we'll talk about the websites, you can keep it private indefinitely, and other websites, there's a limit to how long you can keep it private. Or, as would be consistent with open research practices, you can make it public, you can make your data public, and so that's a benefit. And then so then you post your pre-registration on a website, and there are several different templates on hosting websites, and these templates are of varying complexity. And so we're going to look at some of them. And so the first website that I looked at was As Predicted, and this is hosted by the University of Pennsylvania. And so it's a much less complicated pre-registration. You need to only answer 9 questions. And then another thing about pre-registration, so you may be concerned that pre-registration, you're posting a permanent time-stamped record of what you're going to do for your research. You may be worried, well, what if things change? What if I start collecting data? So the really good thing about that, and this talks about it here, is that if you need to change your data collection, just when you publish your paper, just annotate why you changed it. And so it's not, it doesn't pre-registration doesn't limit the flexibility as long as you explain it to your readers. And so this is an example of a pre-registration, and I wanted to show what a pre-registration looked like, because you can see it's 9 questions. It looks much more, when I first looked at this form, it looks much more simple than I would have thought. I was a little intimidated by pre-registration, but what you can see, it asks for your hypothesis, your variables, conditions, how you're going to deal with outliers and exclusions. So things you definitely should be thinking about before you collect your data. But oftentimes in reality, we don't. We get the data and then we're thinking about all these things. So, and the other really nice thing about this, this format is that it has a self-destruct button. So if you just want to practice, you can choose this self-destruct button and you can type into the pre-registration and it will self-destruct in 24 hours. So the other thing about as predicted, so as predicted doesn't require you to make your pre-registration public. We encourage it as to improve transparency with data collection, but you can keep your pre-registered report private forever if you wanted with as predicted. And as predicted, on their website, they recommend, or they say, we are not requiring people to make their work public because we just want them to pre-register. Like, that is our main goal. And so the other thing about as predicted, and so you may be going through the form and you're not really sure, well, what should I put on this form? And so also linked to, and you can see over here in the right-hand corner, also on this website, is what to put in those boxes. So if you think about the pre-registration is really a document that's people are going to look at to try to determine if you're doing questionable research practices. And so what you want to make sure is the information that you put into the responses shows that you're not doing questionable research practices. And so that there's a document that tells you what a good answer is and what a bad answer is, and then why that answer that they're saying is a bad answer isn't something that's recommended. And so it's very friendly. And also, if you're taking students through this, which I'm planning to do with my students, I mean, this is great training for them. I mean, this shows them, or this helps them to learn to do science correctly, to think about a hypothesis, to think about a control group, think about sample size before they collect the data. Another site I'm going to talk about for pre-registration is the Open Science Framework. And so the Open Science Framework has many resources for you to do your pre-registration. And so so they have resources if you wanted to read more about pre-registration, if you wanted to do webinars, if you wanted to teach people how to do pre-registration. And so why pre-register? It also talks about confirmatory versus exploratory hypothesis. And so oftentimes researchers will perform exploratory hypothesis or hypothesis testing or exploratory research. And so what that means is they collect the data and then look at the data and look for significance and look for patterns, and then they develop the hypothesis after they've seen the data. So that's more of exploratory hypothesis. So you'd imagine that or not you'd imagine, you know that the statistical inferences that you perform with exploratory data are a lot less stringent or a lot less reliable than doing confirmatory research. And confirmatory research is where you're testing a hypothesis. You know which groups you're going to compare before you do the research. So at the OSF site, they have pre-registration. They have 7 different templates, so you can choose one of their templates. You can choose quantitative data, qualitative data. They even have, so even though pre-registration should not be or should be done before you collect data, they have a pre-registration template that you can complete after you've collected some data. So I didn't look in this too much, but definitely something that I encourage you to examine. And so if you open the templates, so as you can see, they tell you a little bit about what you should, the response that you should put for each, or the recommended response for each item. So it walks you through the pre-registration process, but it's definitely more complex than the as predicted. And so you have different levels of complexity you can choose. The other really nice thing about the OSF website and OSF pre-registration is if you're someone that loves analytics, you can see this website provides tons of analytics. You can see who's went to your pre-registration, how many times it's been downloaded, what changes have happened. So, and the OSF Registries has a registry where people can go to search for a particular pre-registration, and so it's a searchable database. So the other type of pre-registration is peer-reviewed pre-registration. And so peer-reviewed pre-registration really is the beginning process of registered reports. And so if you were with us 2 weeks ago, where Rosie talked about registered reports, this is really the beginning of registered reports. And so for peer-reviewed pre-registration, what you'll do is you'll identify a journal that accepts registered reports. And so because this replication crisis is becoming more at the forefront of scientists' mind, there are over 256 journals that accept registered reports. There are 2 sports psychology journals and 1 kinesiology journal, which is the registered report in kinesiology, which is a STORK journal. And so you'll identify a journal that accepts registered reports, and then you'll prepare your pre-registration, and you will submit it to the journal. And so this pre-registration is more complex than the non-peer. And now, so Erin just said that now experimental physiology has a registered report journal. So you'll prepare your pre-registered report, and this pre-registration is a lot more complex than the non-peer-reviewed pre-registration. So for this pre-registration, you'll have introduction, you'll have methods, you'll have statistical analysis, and it should be clear, and you'll submit it to the journal, and the journal will perform peer review on your pre-registration. They're looking for, does the hypothesis seem plausible? Are the methods feasible? Are the statistical analysis reasonable? Is this sufficiently clear? And so once this peer review, or once your pre-registration passes this peer review from these journals, you receive an in-principle acceptance. And so what that means is that the journal will accept your manuscript, whether your results are null, you didn't provide any statistical significance, or whether it's a statistically significant result. And so essentially, well, so I will come back to that in just a moment. So so once your pre-registration, so now we're talking about registered reports, and pre-registration, the peer-reviewed pre-registration is part of registered reports. And so once your pre-registration passes the first stage of peer review, you collect your data, and then you write your report, and you submit it back to the journal that has in principle accepted your pre-registration, and then the journal peer reviews the paper again. But essentially what they're looking for is, did you adhere to the procedures that you outlined in your initial pre-registration? So they're not looking for, is the result statistically significant or not, and if your methods are consistent with what you submitted for your pre-registration, or if they're modified, did you annotate in a sufficiently clear and scientifically rigorous way why they were changed? And then they will publish your report. And so this is the entire process. So the pre-registration undergoes a peer review, you get an in-principle acceptance, and then you perform your study, and then it's peer reviewed again, and then the full manuscript is accepted. So that's part of the a registered report. There's one more website that I wanted to just talk about really briefly. And so this website is Prospero, and this accepts pre-registrations for systematic reviews. And so that's available. So one good thing about registered reports. And so registered reports, we talked about with a peer review, pre-registration, in principle acceptance. And so the really nice thing about the registered reports is that no matter what your results, whether they're null or statistically significant, your manuscript will still get published. And so this is really, really different than the normal research process. And so in the normal research process, what you do is you design, well, I'm going to say not normal research, but what happens commonly. And commonly research practices, you design your study and it takes you a while, and then you're like, oh my goodness, I need to collect data. And so you collect data, and then you get this data and you're like, oh my gosh, I need to, you have all this data and I need to analyze it. And you think, okay, well, I need to find the statistically significant result, because to get promotion, to get tenure, you need to publish papers. And what we've learned as scientists is that, like the researchers that found the opposite results of Dr. Bem, what is published are pretty much only statistically significant results commonly, unless you're doing a registered report. And so the commonly or traditional research practice is that you collect data, you analyze your data, you're performing all these inferences, which are not statistically rigorous. And so you're doing, it's called p-hacking. And then you interpret your data and you're like, oh, I found statistical significance. And so then you explain to yourself, you say, oh, this makes total sense. This was my hypothesis the whole time, because you forget. And so then you're performing harking, which is hypothesis after you've collected your data. And then you write up your results, and you forget that the hypothesis that you identified after analyzing your data was really not the hypothesis you maybe initially started with, but you don't describe that in your research. So it looks to people reading your paper as if you've followed rigorous research practices, And then it goes through peer review, and then peer review editors and reviewers are looking for statistically significant results because they think that null results are not exciting. And so this is publication bias. And so you might be saying, well, does this really happen? And so this is a tweet from just a few weeks ago. And I didn't black out the name because I discussed this with Vanessa, and she said this person is putting it on social media, so why black out the name? But this researcher was bemoaning the fact that his null report that was written up well was not published because they received a null result or a null result. So, and then you might remember 2 weeks ago, Rosie looked at a paper by Shiel et al. And so here's the reference. And so this is a really, and we talked about, or I mentioned that if your data analysis or methodology changes after you've written your pre-registration and while you're collecting data, you should annotate it. And as long as you annotate it in your manuscript, then it will be published, and it will be, if it's accepted as in principle, it will still be published. And so this paper is a really nice example of annotation of how things changed as they were collecting data. It does a really nice job. It's really, it is a very interesting read. But so what they found is they were looking at, in psychology, they chose journals, and they were looking at the traditional journals. So these are journals that don't accept registered reports. And they were looking at how many the first hypothesis were confirmed in those papers. And so what they found is that 96% of the first hypothesis were confirmed or found to be statistically significant. And so that's a really high amount. So then they were comparing this to registered reports. So similar registered report journals. And Dr. Yunling just posted a link to this paper in chat. And so registered reports, you'll remember, are peer-reviewed pre-registrations, in principle acceptance, and then accepted whether the result is null or statistically significant. So this leaves it really up to the data, and null results aren't rejected. And so what they found was that only about 40-some% of the first hypothesis that were published in the paper were found to be statistically significant. And so just as a person who tries to make good choices, I know that 96% of the time, what I think isn't right. It's closer to like the 40%. And so you can see how publication bias is likely to be affecting the results that we're seeing as scientists, we're seeing as data consumers. And so, registered reports are part of open science, and you can do a peer-reviewed pre-registration. And one of the journals that publishes registered reports is this registered report in kinesiology. And so this is our STORK journal. So here's their website. And so, but really what I'm trying to do with this talk is tell you about pre-registration, tell you about the replication crisis and how dire it is and how it's affecting all of us. And really to hope that, you know, if pre-registration isn't for you, but you're interested in open science, just start somewhere. And so this open science framework is a really nice website in that they have tools for collecting data, storing data, pre-registration a template. They have, they have lots and lots of resources to promote open science practice. And they also integrate with probably a lot of the tools that you're already using. And so open science is, focus is to reduce questionable research practices. And so this will be, so these are some of the questionable resources, research practices. So p-hacking, harking, we talked about. Another thing is outcome switching. And this is where you you test, or you have many different variables that you're testing, but you only report your statistically significant variables, and publication bias, which we talked about. And if you're wondering how frequently these questionable research practices are occurring, research manuscripts are starting to report how much they're finding these questionable research practices. And so having open science allows other researchers or consumers of research to go back and look at the pre-registration, compare it to the final report to see if there was any potential, p-hacking or not reporting of variables. And so why is this important? And so this is really, really, really important to me as a scientist, because I want to be able to build the work that I do and work with and teach the students that I work with that the correct way to do science. So not the common way, but the correct way. And so that I know that I'm building my work on a solid foundation, and it's not just the statistically significant results that were generated from questionable research practices. And also as a consumer, if you think about, you go to your doctor or you try to use evidence-based practices, but you realize that those practices are based on only those statistically significant results. So you never see, the other side of the story, the null results that can be just as informative. And so pre-registration is a way for me to continue my work through the pandemic and to support these open science practices, which are really, really important. And so I'll open it to questions. I should have said, if you, I'm sorry, I just kept talking, but if you had any questions, you could have unmuted yourself and talked. So any questions or comments? So I see Joe, we had a similar experience about publication bias. However, the impact and significance of this study was relatively low. And conclusion of a certain system not being valid has limited implications for future studies. For example, there may be many systems in the market, and I'm not sure whether it's worthy to publish a lack of validity for each system. This is a direct quote from a reviewer. Wow. It's, and if you're only getting half of the story. And so Rosie was talking in her presentation about registered reports. She said that a year ago, her lab had published a null findings. And then the following year, another group published statistically significant findings. And she was looking back, and she found that even though both groups were addressing the same problem, the group that found the statistically significant result were cited more times. So it's not just the publication bias, it's also the citation bias. And then, if you're working with a medical doctor and they're trying to determine your treatment and they're working on only statistically significant results based on questionable research practices, it gets scary. So any other comments, questions, open to discussion. Anything anything more about pre-registration?
So everybody should have the ability to unmute themselves now.
I see a comment in here from someone asking about a lack of like high quality tier 1 journals, which is important at some institutions, I'm sure, for like tenure and promotion. There's not many, especially that would publish kinesiology papers that offer registered reports. So what would your advice be, or I guess anybody else on the call's advice be?
So it is a I think more and more journals are adopting registered reports, and I think this is a movement that's happening across science. And so I think that even though I think like being part of this addressing the replication crisis over the long term will benefit a person's career. But this, you're right, like open science shouldn't be just something that early career researchers need to address. Like people on tenure committees, they need to recognize that that being involved in these open science practices and publishing registered reports should be recognized. So is there a pre-registration for all areas? So there are 256 journals, including, I think, Nature Biology, I think, was the most recent journal to accept registered reports. So there are 256 journals that accept registered reports. Also, if you go on Open Science Framework, you can search for this list of journals. But for kinesiology is a broad discipline. And so registered reports in kinesiology is the journal that I'm aware of that accepts all types of kinesiology work. I don't know if that answers your question.
The question may have been pre-registration instead of registered reports.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So, so pre-registration. You can, if you don't want your pre-registration peer reviewed, so you just want to post your pre-registration, you're not limited by what work you're doing. You can go onto the As Predicted, you can go on the Open Science Framework.
Acabei de ver o áudio. Então, assim, eu acho que eu troquei 2 vezes, tá? Primeiro eu troquei, eu acho que eu tinha colocado aumento, aí agora, antes de semana passada, que eu tinha mexido um pouco nele, eu tinha deixado até em amarelo o texto.
Guess we had a hot mic there.
But there is one thing, and Erin, correct me if I'm wrong, that some journals will not accept, oh no, that's preprint, correct? So some journals will not accept if your work was pre-printed, but no, do any journals have a problem with pre-registration?
I can't imagine. None that I know of. If they publish clinical trials, then they have to be accepting pre-registration, because a clinical, like if you have an NIH-funded study and it qualifies as a clinical trial, you have to go and like register it at clinicaltrials.gov, which is a form of pre-registration. Now they don't ask some of the same questions as OSF or As Predicted do that are helpful scientifically, but no, I can't imagine it. If they did, I would just throw that statement at them that I just said, because that would be ridiculous. But yeah, so yeah, I think any journal, like I can't imagine that being an issue. I would also add that I think so Public Library of Science PLOS is now doing registered reports, and I think PeerJ is. I remember reading something about that. They either they are considering it or they already are. I can't remember which one.
And All Trials, right? That's another pre-registration site for clinical trials out of the UK.
I'm not
Correct on that?
familiar with them. I'm not familiar with them, but that's definitely there's definitely other clinical trial registries. Which now that I think about it, like even if you're an NIH funded study, you don't actually have to register at clinicaltrials.gov. It just needs to be one of like a group of clinical trial registries.
Thanks for the presentation. I have one question, like how do you, like if you pre-register a study, how do you mention it in your paper? Like do you mention it in the methods, like a link to the repository where you published it, or where do you do it?
Yeah, so what I've seen the pre-registered being referred in the methods, and there's a link, and so that's the really nice thing, and I'm thank you for bringing this up. So once you pre-register your study, you get a DOI, and so you can share that DOI. And so the other really nice thing is that if you are like a graduate student, or to show that you're doing the work to perform a rigorous study, you can use that, you can link to that DOI. And so, you know, in your CV or when you're applying for work, and that's really nice because usually in how research is commonly done, it's not until the final you've written up the results and the manuscript has been accepted when you can actually refer to it. And so oftentimes, you know, if someone puts a in preparation on their CV, it's, you know, you don't know if it's going to be accepted. So looking at that CV, it's not as it's not as strong as a DOI or an accepted manuscript, a DOI for a pre-registration.
So I've commonly just seen it as like we pre-registered our hypotheses or experiments, whatever the end statement at the end there, at such and such, and then it's just a link to the DOI. I think there's even way, like you could probably even input with the DOI as like a citation in like a program like Zotero or EndNote, and it actually can go on your reference list, especially if it has the DOI.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you have a pre-registration, which is this long document, could also be an option to put it as an appendix, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the nice thing is with like OSF, it's a permanent they have it in place where even if the Center for Open Science like ran out of money tomorrow, the website's still supposed to be up for the next 50 years, so everything's archived. So the DOI will like always link to that pre-registration document, so it's a permanent document, like set in stone, which is nice.
And so there's a question in the chat. What happened to Daryl Bem? So his research wasn't retracted, and so in 2017, I came across an article in Slate, and they were talking about the study and the launch of the replication crisis, and essentially one of the quotes from Dr. Bem in the Slate study was that he was publishing his results, or he published his scientific results to persuade people to think a particular way. So essentially, it sounds like he was guiding his research to a particular outcome so that he could, persuade people to accept it as truth. And so, yeah.
He's doing quite well going to meetings on parapsychology, from what I've read.
Interesting. So you can, so Zach, I think someone asked it if you can have a blinded version for peer review for the pre-registration, probably maybe for registered reports they were asking, and Zach said yes. A comment on the ECR point, if not published in Quality One journal would be a direct disadvantage to you, then a pre-registration on the OSF is the next best thing that would certainly be of no disadvantage. Secondly, for a study that you are concerned will not be accepted due to predicted null findings or gatekeeping, perhaps it contradicts something, a registered report guarantees acceptance once your stage 1 has been accepted, which is a major advantage for some studies. Thank you, Rosie. That's perfect. That really helps.
And it's important, just to follow up with, it's important to remember, if you have a registered report, stage 1 acceptance or in principle acceptance, you can still publish your final report elsewhere. You don't have to publish in that journal. But as Rosie indicated, it guarantees that you will have an outlet.
Yeah, and so it will help the file drawer problem where people are just, they can't publish their null results, and so they're filing them away and never see the light of day. And so registered reports is a way to address the null results. All right. Any other questions or comments? All right. Well, if there's nothing else, thank you everyone for your attention and for being here today. I really appreciate it. And this presentation will be published on, or will be posted on YouTube, and so you can go to the links. There's lots of links throughout. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Sherwood.
Thank you for the presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rosetta.